The UFO community is divided into very distinct camps, those who are searching for the conspiracy and those who are looking to unify. Both have their value, but those who are looking to unify receive far less publicity. Glenn Steckling is the keeper of a precious archive of materials based on the life and experience of George Adamski, a gentleman contactee who was visited by people from Venus and other planets back in the 1950s and 60s. And I've always just loved this story. It just appeals to me on a very intuitive level. And it's interesting because as George passed off his briefcase to you, you inherited the briefcase and you carry it with you today.
I carry, it isn't the same old briefcase because it fell apart, but yes, but the contents,
that's right.
First generation photographs.
Yes.
I have copies of the films that have been transferred onto DVD. That already happened when I did the transfer for 20th Century Fox for the remake of The Day the Earth Stood Still.
And I was going to ask you about that, and that's my next question. So what was The Day the Earth Stood Still patterned after?
The significance of that movie, and there is some truth behind it, because an event happened to that prior to the end of World War II, except for the landing was in Alaska, and it was attended by 4 heads of state. But the entire emphasis of The Day the Earth Stood Still was the fact that congruently to the observations and sightings that have happened, this craft came, landed close to the White House on the Mall, and I remember walking by that mall many times in the 60s when we lived there, and the space person came out along with the robotic, which is common to all these type of crafts. They have either a robotic or an android.
Right.
And it shows psychologically exactly the type of mentality both of the people of this world, which hasn't changed, the military, which hasn't changed, and also our government officials and how they deal with that. And so this person goes out amongst the general public and begins to try to understand how it is that we have this unconscionable fear and irrationality. And there's a very famous section of that film where he's standing there with the boy that he is boarding in the room, and the guy is coming down the newspaper, or pardon me, the newsreel person with the microphone, and he keeps going from person to person, how do you feel, how do you feel? And when they get to him and he says, well, I'm concerned when we substitute irrational behavior and fear for logic and science, and they pull the mic right away.
Right.
And so the film is excellent, and it also shows that there is a contingency of science-related academics who are also very interested in this field. They don't always throw their names behind it, and that's not how this works, and we can talk about that later. But it also depicts the dangers that we skirt along the abyss continually on how we treat the planet, our ability to destroy each other and the world we live on, and the acknowledgement of that relationship. Mm-hmm. So the movie, all in all, George loved the movie. It depicts very accurately the type of contacts that have happened during that era and also since.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, this is probably out of place, but how did he feel about the story of Valiant Thor by Frank Stranges?
Well, I can only tell you the experiences we had. Mm-hmm. George passed away in April of '65. In the fall of '65, there was a knock at our door. My father goes to open the door, and there stands Valiant Thor.
Really? Oh, tell me. I didn't know
and
this.
My father says to him, he laughs. He says to him, I know who you are. You're a misinformation agent for the government.
Your father said that?
And Valiant Thor laughed, and he says, you're absolutely correct.
Wow.
And my father says, well, I have been thoroughly briefed on you and your behaviors and what is going on. And he said to them, you will find no traction here, nor welcome here. And so Mr. Thor said, thank you very much, have a nice day, and off he went. That is our interaction with Mr. Thor in 1965. And that's the only definitive that I can give you, only that which we have experienced
ourselves. Well, that's responsible. But look, having known of Thor mm-hmm. and the contributions with those in power at the time, right? If providing that's part of the story, what was the nature of the disinformation? Well, how was he
Well, first
skewing?
of all, he was not from Venus. And secondly, the promotion of the information that came downstream for that is contrary to the actual circumstances. So, and this is very common in this field. What happens is, it's like fishing. In order to catch a good fish, you got to use a well-baited hook. So these days what happens is they take established, known events, which there's very little knowledge about, but we can pretty much securely say this happened, like Roswell and other things. And then based upon that foundation, then the injection of other information in order to take it into variable tangents.
Kind of piggybacks off of it like a parasite.
Exactly, well said. And so it is a method upon which to grab those who don't know, and even better, those who think they know a portion of it, and then run with it. Because unless you have that foundation in the truth of the actual event, you will accept everything that happens downstream.
Right.
And this is where we're getting ourselves in a great deal of trouble in this field.
Well, I couldn't agree more. So, no, going back to Adamski, again, as I call him, a gentleman contactee, and that has a lot of connotations. It means there is a type of academic vigor, a morality, and ethics that he stood for, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But there's something else, of course, that strikes me and has always struck me in this conversation, and that is he had some unique physical features, if I recall. And we might just bring up one or two of the most obvious ones because my question follows on that.
Well, we put a great deal of emphasis on the external and very little on the internal. He had a particular symbol on his form that passed away when he passed away. But as far as being any different biologically than you and I, he was not. And neither are these beings that come from other worlds. They are exactly like you and I. And if we look at the chemical scientists and the biologists and listen to what they say, we find that the commonality of creation comes from the elements from space. And all that is seeded on this planet, about 2 tons a day, compromise the organic materials that eventually bring about life as we know it. We trail this material behind our planet, so do all the other planets. We intermix, that's how you get a meteorite from Mars and Antarctica and so on and so forth. So we are basically a very large oven with many different pies, all made of the same material and over time evolving in the same method. But as far as George was concerned, this particular symbol basically stood for the evolution of his particular character.
It's been explained to me by a couple of different people, their understanding of the track of progression to incarnate on Earth for beings who have come to help in particular. It starts in one star system and gains density as it goes on. Pleiades is often hit, and then it ultimately ends up at Venus before incarnating on Earth. And that's a trajectory 2 independent people talked about. So, if that's true, I guess my question is really more, is he one of those people that has gravitated from that Venusian path to Earth for the express purpose of helping and bringing higher knowledge to us, and thus allowing him to have these constant relationships with these other people because he's maybe of that tribe?
Well, let's be clear on a couple things. First of all, there is a race of humanoids that travel space. And they, as part of their purpose, colonize worlds. And they do that throughout the cosmos. We have remnants of that symbology of those people, which are called the Triterians, which is symbolized by half man, half fish. And of course, if you look now at the symbology of Poseidon and Neptune, this is left over from that earlier representation. Now, as far as the reincarnation aspect, we all have multiple lives in the past. We've had to, because over the period of millions of years, we have to, nature allows us the progression of learning what needs to be used towards our further evolvement as a character and of those around us. That cannot be construed in a single lifetime. And if we look at most of the religions, they do teach reincarnation. In fact, I have a very good book written by theologians that said why Jesus taught reincarnation, not resurrection. The church changed that term. And so when he stood on the mountain of transfiguration and became all these other faces, he was showing to his disciples who he had been. And for anyone else, who you've been in the past, since we'd like to glorify ourselves, is irrelevant. We have been good, we have been bad, the good, bad, the ugly.
It's a process of learning.
It's a process, right? Anything and everything requires our own individual attention, responsibility, and action. Just like John Kennedy said, we have progressed to a state over a period of time, and when you reverse that, it will still take a period of time, hopefully, if it's unabridged, in order to return to that state. And we have to take responsibility for ourselves. Do we get a helping hand? Absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
But we have to make the choice, and unfortunately, these days, we have chosen the other direction.
Right. And at the time, I mean, the messages that were coming to Adamski were very life-affirming.
Absolutely.
On every level. And that is useful to us today, especially considering what became injected into the whole UFO scene starting in the 80s and 90s, which was almost exclusively fear.
Yes. To make it simply put, and as I mentioned in the re-release of Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery, we originally developed a dogma during the 40s and 50s. We were going to deny these crafts exist, no matter who said so. We were going to deny their existence, their capabilities, and the fact that they come amongst us. When that could no longer be sustained, and we started going out into space, our space program, even though there were many who were discontent with that agenda and spoke openly against it, had to be congruent to that original thought. You cannot say something doesn't exist and then go into space and said, oh boy, it does.
Right.
Because somebody's going to start pointing the finger and said, oh boy, our pants on fire, right? And so officially we developed a separate agenda to say, okay, when we go out into space, we will make the conditions very hostile, unsustainable to life, and so on and so forth. But as you can see, if enough research is done, you can find holds in all of those reports to show atmosphere on the moon, water, the same on Mars, conditions better on Venus. Because as we go along in time, ever so slowly, a sliver of information is left to us. And for most people who don't pay attention or don't follow a thought from point A to point B, it just goes by. But if you start to collect it over enough period of time, like we have done at the Adamski Foundation, and you make it available to the public, you can start to paint a much broader picture.
Yes. In this book, The Mystery of the Flying Saucers, part, is it 2 or 3? 2. One of the things I love about the book is, besides speaking about Adamski himself, is the science that he was bringing from these other people to us, and we're going to get into that in a moment. One thing that the book impresses, and that I have been impressed with before, is he was very rigorous in looking for people to try to invalidate what he had been told, his findings, his evidence. Now, he fell to the misfortune of, some shenanigans where photos would simply disappear, evidence would simply disappear, and that kind of thing, which was unfair. But he actually challenged people to disprove his findings.
That's right. He offered several $1,000s reward to anybody who could disprove or show fakery of the photographs. And as we've shown in the book, and as we've discussed before when we did our original interview many years ago, is that the volume of evidence has always stood up behind the examination of George's photos and the films, in which I will give you a copy of. And that is what irks his critics the greatest. They will try anything and everything to try to discredit those photographs, but none of them are experts, and yet experts have come forward to show that they are optically correct of the type of crafts they are. None of them can do anything but shoot off opinions or replicate opinions that others have said, so you get second and third and fourth hand domino effect. And I have openly challenged these people many times, okay, let's sit down and let's hash out the facts. And they don't want to do that.
Right.
And so, to put it quite clear, George Adamski is, to a great degree, especially within this field, highly ignored.
Yes.
and on purpose.
Yes.
Of all the people, and I can name dozens over the last 5 decades who have come and gone in this field, nobody receives the negative attention that George does.
Which is interesting.
Consistently.
And to me, he is one of the most credible of them all.
Because he did 2 things. He talked about human beings coming to visit us, and we
Yes.
don't want to hear that. Already since the 50s, we have pushed both from the media standpoint and the movie standpoint and across the fields, this idea that everything has to be monstrous, bizarre, attacking, aggressive, like Reagan said. Amazing how quickly we would unify if an aggressive force came from space.
Well, especially if they look like praying mantises or ant people or something like that.
Well, worse than that, you can remember the television program called V, where they looked like you and I, and then in private they pulled off the mask
yeah, exactly.
and were reptilians.
Yeah.
Because we always go back to
Right.
that, because it
Right.
sells.
Right.
And that's basically what this is. This has nothing to do with educating the public, has nothing to do with being responsible for what you show. It sells and makes some people very rich in order to do that.
Right.
And so in George's case, he stuck to that, human beings, and he stuck to life in this solar system. While he made the statement, I could have had my life so much easier if I just twisted it a little bit and said, these visitations come from another solar system. We had no way of verifying that. It was conveniently too far away. He said, but that wasn't the truth.
Right.
And the truth is where they come from, and he stood by all means by the truth. And his story never wavered, was never embellished, and never changed. And he was well recognized because of that.
He was, and he did not profit from it.
Not at all.
He was not a profiteer at all. And again, he offered open challenge. And when a few thousand to several $1,000s was a lot of money in that day.
1950s.
A lot of money. Yeah, that was a year's salary for people.
Oh, absolutely.
In the day.
And he gave the rights to publish his materials and books freely across the world without royalties or any contracts. He gave his pictures openly to whoever came to visit him.
Yeah.
And so if anybody claims that George profited about it, he died. He owned no house, no car, no property, no estate, a couple suits to his name, and if you look in the San Diego County Registry, I think the entire estate was worth just a couple $1,000s.
Yeah.
George was not in this field, and he certainly could have made lots of money. He was offered millions to shut up. So was my father. My father was offered $1 million by the intelligence community if he would denounce George Adamski, and my father told him to kiss his behind.
Good for your dad. Well, now, in the day, however, Adamski had access to positions in very high places. I remember reading one part of the book in which it says he had access through an underground passage to the White House.
What happened is George briefed 2 presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, and took him to an air base out in the California desert where one of these craft came down, and they interacted. Did not go for a ride, just interacted on the apron. And also John Kennedy at a different place. And George used to carry a White House access pass in his wallet, and we witnessed that. And there are several entrances to the White House. Of course, if you come through the main entrance, everybody's standing there taking pictures, and you're logged into a particular book and so on and so forth. But all of the important stuff comes through the underground accesses that are leading into the White House through the military secure zones. And he had an access to that, and he used it on several occasions when he was summoned there. So George was interested in providing factual substance. We were living in a time at the end of an era that broadcast nuclear destruction, the elimination of life on this planet. He felt that it was vitally necessary that these officials who made the decisions based on accurate statements and facts and not hearsay and opinions.
Right.
And that's what he went for. He didn't care about his name, meant nothing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get into some of the people he met with, and let's start with those from Venus and the way they described their life, which simply seems to be a more ideal version of Earth life because they seem to have worked through some of the issues of aggression and such, longer lifespans, healthier bodies, right? Generally attractive people, more companionable social structures.
All which is available to us here, we just choose not to partake of it. When George made the statement that you're capable of living in your body for several hundred years, 300-400 years, everybody scoffed at the idea. Yet recently geneticists came out and said, yeah, you're capable of living in this form at least 200-300 years if you were treated correctly.
Right.
Right? And so we have the ability to participate in this betterment. In their particular civilization, and by no means are they the only civilization in this solar system, they have worked past the point of being fractionalized and divided.
Right.
We work consistently here to divide people into race, into gender, into state of thought, into religious thinking, and so on and so forth. This is the method upon which we control the masses. There, they have worked past that state and realized that when you work together, you get far further along the line, because now you work together towards a common standard of living, towards a common value and a common progression. And you don't waste so much of your time trying to find out what your talents are, trying to get an education, trying to get a job that you really didn't want to do, 50 years of working for the government and paying taxes. And so we lead very unfulfilled lives here. And in their society, they don't do that. And it makes what the whole issue to this is, and I've been asked this before, I had a conversation yesterday evening, in fact, is that George made a statement, and so did one of the space people whom I met. He said, for most of you who come to our world, you would be highly uncomfortable. And I asked, in what manner? He said, not because of the environment. He said, because it's a state of thinking. We work together, your thoughts are open to everyone, there are no secrets, there's no belittlement. So basically, to put it simple, let us say this is an island of this type of behavior and activity. You don't even get to the shores until you're developed and willing to participate collectively into that type of
To be
advancement.
transparent even, yes.
To that. And so they do not have individuals who are, shall we say, malfeasance, or we don't want to do this, or we want to do it our way, and so on and so forth. You don't even get there until you've worked out those issues beforehand. So when you go to this place, or visit this place, you find that you become integrated into that betterment. And imagine the discontinuity it must be to experience that, as George did, and by far he was not the only one, to experience that and then have to come back here and deal with the reality, not the mysticism and all the sensationalism and all the things that have been injected into this field. When the space people make contact, they vet you very carefully. Right. This is not some haphazard thing that's thrown out there, because it can change your life so dramatically that if you cannot deal with it, you no longer can function in your own society and own world. So it becomes a counterproductive experience rather than a productive. So they watch and record and they evaluate us very closely. Ooh. And George went through that his entire life.
I'm repeatedly struck by the intelligent, useful, and gentle nature of George Adamski and wonder why these voices have been minimized in favor of the big conspiracy stories. In the end, it's up to us to decide who stood to gain from their silencing. Meanwhile, you can do your own research by contacting Glenn at georgeadamskifoundation.com. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on Gaia.